this is exactly who to stash at the end of your bench to guarantee yourself success later down the line of the fantasy football season and even in the next few weeks. That aren't the basic guys everybody else wastes your time talking about. So if you do appreciate that, hit that subscribe button. We're reaching a ton of new people, which I am very appreciative of, and hit that like button if you do feel very, very generous and you want some good luck for your fantasy team. But I'll also give you a quick list of defenses at the end of the video that have really good matchups in week 9 and 10 and possibly even 11 that we can stash ahead of everybody else, so it's not a frenzy on the waiver wire to go get them. But the number one waiver ad, we got to talk about the combination of John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson, because one of these guys needs to be your number one stash option, and here's all the information you need to know about it. Obviously, we have Diggs going down with a non-contact knee injury last week. Turns out to be an ACL injury. He's out for the rest of the season. We already have Nico Collins on IR until week 11, so everything is put on CJ Stroud and Tank Dell. But with those two guys being out, there's an average of 20 targets per game being freed up into this offense. That's more than half of CJ Stroud's average pass attempts. Someone's going to have to get this ball. So if we look at Xavier Hutch, he's a slot wide receiver that came out of Iowa State. He's a Wan'Dale Robinson type of slot guy if you were to compare his play style and what I believe to be more of a one-to-one replacement for Stephon Diggs in the way that he's used in the offense. But we look at the Texans, I don't necessarily believe that they're going to lean towards building an offense around more of a slower, low A-dot kind of guy that isn't necessarily a proven receiver in the NFL yet. So then you look at John Mechie, a third-round rookie pick from Alabama. He made the roster over Noah Brown last year after having a pretty good season as far as that's concerned. But he's more of a raw and unknown kind of wide receiver prospect that we don't really know if he's going to match this style of offense because he has a similar play to Nico Collins and to Tank Dell, which are already more vertical threats that they have enough of. My lean would be more towards Xavier Hutchinson. He'll probably have the higher floor. I do think John Mechie has more potential to break out, but in the way that this offense is run and the wide receiver options they already have, his floor is really, really risky. So take that for what you will. My take is going to be Xavier Hutchinson, but let me know which wide receiver you're picking up in the comments. I would love to see what you guys have to say about that. But moving into another potential stash that I really do believe we need to be looking at is Parker Washington because of all the injuries we have going on with the Jacksonville offense. Christian Kirk out for the season with a collarbone injury that puts him into the number 2 slot almost guaranteed, pretty much guaranteed. And then you have Brian Thomas Jr. now considered day-to-day, which I think is a bit egregious. I think it's a little bit more serious than that. Doug Peterson is one of the least trustworthy coaches when it comes to injuries and depth charts. He has a 50% accuracy through his entire career. It is a little bit better as far as just the Jaguars isolated, but even then, he's not a very trustworthy coach. He could miss this week. It could be nothing. We really don't know yet, but either way, we already have Gabe Davis working through a shoulder injury, so there's literally nobody left in this offense. And you look at Washington, the guy that filled in the most for all of these wide receivers, a 5th-round rookie from Penn State. He saw some light last year when he was filling in as well. He had 2 games over a 60% snap share and had some pretty good success in those games. And now he has no choice, but he has to run these important routes now. Last week, he led the wide receivers in routes run and snap percentage. Yes, there was a ton of injuries, but that's still a really good sign, which is why we're going to be stashing him. That led him to 3 receptions on 4 targets for 46 yards against the Green Bay defense, one of the tougher ones as far as matchup goes, which makes Washington a worthwhile stash for you in a Jaguars offense that might not be amazing, but their defense is really, really bad, which is going to force these wide receivers to run more routes and lean on a more pass-heavy script. And when you don't have as many wide receivers in this offense because of all the injuries, Parker Washington is set up to be a pretty good guy. Brenton Strange is also a decent ad that you can look at. He's being utilized more. Without Christian Kirk so far this year, it looks like they're going to run more heavy 12 personnel sets, which would obviously give him usage, and we've seen what he's been able to do without Evan Ingram in this offense. He's a pretty good pass-catching tight end and did see a good amount of routes compared to Ingram last week because of the injury to Christian Kirk. But looking at another wide receiver, I believe, again, this is a really amazing week for stashes. It's going to be Elijah Moore. I've talked about him for a few weeks now, so I will keep it generally brief to the underlying numbers that are the most important. He led the team in targets last week with 12, which led him to see 80 receiving yards, and he was also 3rd in the entire NFL as far as week 8 isolated numbers in separation rate with a 19% win rate on his routes. That's a really, really good sign. His utilization in this offense isn't necessarily new. He's another type of Wan'Dale Robinson or Demario Douglas style of player who might not have the best ADOT, but definitely will fight for extra yardage, and we've seen that kind of potential last year when he was coming from the Jets to the Browns. Now, if I had to pick, I would be leaning more on Cedric Tillman. If he is available on waivers still, he would be my number 1 option. But Jameis is upgrading this offense, whether you want to believe it or not. Deshaun Watson was just that bad. We do have to understand that the fill-in quarterback theory is real. When backups come in, the offense elevates a little bit, then it will come down to earth eventually. We saw the same thing with Andy Dalton. There's no way that he averages 330 passing yards consistently. If he does, that's great for all these receiving options, but we're not really expecting that, baking them into the price of wanting to stash these guys. Jameis Winston is gonna pass. Will it be efficient every week? Probably not. There's gonna be some interceptions in there, but the volume is going to be there for him, which is why I see Elijah Moore as a worthwhile stash playing out of the slot. Those guys typically see a higher snap share and target percentage than the other wide receivers playing on the outside. And I do quickly need to talk about Jalen McMillan. I know there's a lot of different opinions on him now that he didn't have a good game last week. I'll go over it quick because everybody talks about him with the numbers that nobody's telling you. The first thing, he had a pretty underwhelming game last week. 9.2 fantasy points. You can't hide or run from that. But he did run the most routes out of every single wide receiver, and he had 7 targets. Baker just completely missed him on a wide open crosser that honestly would have resulted in a huge touchdown play with 10 plus fantasy points. They missed on another deep shot as well in the end zone. He had the potential to have a really, really good game. It just didn't end up happening. And the great thing is, yes, we have Cade Otton leading this team in targets and yards, and honestly being a great fill-in for Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. But McMillan was second, only behind Cade Otton in first read target share last week at 21%. The next highest wide receiver was at 9. That's really, really strong for him. Yes, the numbers haven't necessarily been there as far as fantasy points, but he has room to grow. Even when Mike Evans comes back, Chris Godwin is still out of this offense. The interesting part about him is that he is seeing the volume. He's just not necessarily really efficient with it. He saw 15 targets in the last 2 weeks. Usually, rookies are kind of the opposite, where they'll be really efficient on the low number of usage and targets they will get, and eventually those targets start coming and they break out. It's kind of what we saw with Rashee Rice last year. He's seeing the opposite of that. Now, that could be taken as a red flag, but I did want to get all of these statistics for you so you guys can be as knowledgeable as possible. Again, if you do appreciate that, subscribe to the channel if you are new. It helps me out a ton. But looking a little bit deeper to a stash that we can make is Jalen Coker from the Panthers. That is really an interesting stash because we don't have Deontay Johnson on this offense. He has been traded to the Ravens. That's leaving a good amount of targets open to this offense. Even with Deontay Johnson healthy, since week 5, his snap percentage has consistently been above 50%. And now that Deontay Johnson is gone, it's almost guaranteed that that number is going to be around 70 or more percent of the snaps every single week. He's been having extremely strong numbers and positive numbers as far as an undrafted rookie goes. Actually better than Xavier Legette as far as efficiency, but obviously he's been seeing the touchdowns and more snaps because he is the earlier drafted rookie. But he had a PFF grade above 80 last week, which is extremely positive. He also had great numbers in yards after the catch and yards per target, all green in that category, generating a first down on 11% of his routes run. That's a very high number for a rookie especially. Now without Deontay Johnson, again, he is no option but to be the number 2. Honestly, he could make the case to be the number 1. Xavier Legette hasn't necessarily shown us anything amazing to guarantee himself that number 1 slot. Now we do have to be honest. The Panthers offense isn't amazing. It's not going to be efficient, but rookies do tend to come around as the second half of the season turns in, and their bye week is in week 11, so we could see a big jump from then. You don't necessarily have to pick him up now unless you're in a deeper league, but definitely keep your eye on him moving forward. Another guy I really want to be keeping an eye on and a running back that I'm buying in on is Kendre Miller. He is not seeing a ton of snaps yet, which is understandable because he just got placed out of IR in week 7. And in that first game off of IR, he saw 29% of the snaps, leading to 6 carries, and actually ran a good amount of routes out of the backfield, leading to 3 targets. And then you look at last week, his numbers were decent. You do have to understand that he only played half the game because he got injured again, but was on pace to beat and match the numbers from the week before in week 7. But on those snaps, yes, I'm aware that it's a very small sample size. He had a 50% missed tackle force percentage, and that was first in week 8. He was also second in running back elusiveness rating at 183.3, and 13th in yards after contact with 3.67. None of this means he's going to outperform Alvin Kamara and be the next RB1, especially after the contract extension. But there is a world where Alvin Kamara maybe gets banged up later down the line of the year. He was dealing with a hand and a rib injury. Then maybe the season starts to get away from the Saints and they just kind of give up, putting Kendre Miller in the game more just to see what they have in the future. He is only 22 years old. The Saints don't necessarily have the best record as of right now, so it's just something to keep an eye on. And very quickly, Drake May does need to be rostered, and I'm honestly surprised his roster percentage is this low. Last week he left with a concussion and may not play this week, which honestly would drop his roster percentage even more. But essentially last week in one quarter of football, he put up 11.5 fantasy points. He has a good amount of rushing upside, which is going to keep his floor a little bit higher, which is kind of what you want in a Patriots offense that isn't amazing and doesn't have the highest caliber of weapons. But in fantasy football, you don't necessarily need those to be viable. I would still be rostering Drake May. But as for some defenses we can go through and stash for the future weeks to be ahead of everybody else, the Chargers is going to be my first option. They get a matchup against the Browns this week, which maybe scary for some people that think Jameis Winston is amazing. I think he's still turnover prone. And then they also get that followed by the Titans and the Bengals, two teams that are struggling as far as points allowed to defenses. They just ran up 12 points against the Saints. And speaking of the Saints, they should also be a priority for you. They get the second best matchup against the Panthers this week. You can't really find a better high upside matchup than that. The Panthers offensive line is also terrible. They are second in points given up to defenses this year. They get the Falcons in week 10, which is a bit more of a rough one, but then followed by the Browns again in week 11. And I'm also liking the Falcons defense, which hasn't been amazing, but they get the Cowboys, Saints, and Broncos in their next 3. Something to think about. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I will see you in the buy low and sell high trade target video coming tomorrow.